A gang of bikers terrorizes a small community, demanding submission. But an aging veteran, burdened by his past yet fueled by resilience, refuses to back down. What happens when courage faces ruthless power? Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey coming tomorrow. Joe Marshall crouched beside his old, rusted truck. His prosthetic leg stretched awkwardly as he tightened a bolt under the hood. The tools scattered on the ground were well worn, much like the man who wielded them. His work was interrupted by the low, guttural growl of motorcycle engines breaking the peace of the trailer park. Joe straightened up, his hand instinctively brushing the dirt off his pants as two bikers from the Iron Fangs gang pulled up, their engines roaring louder than necessary. The taller of the two, a lanky man with greasy black hair and a wolf emblem on his leather jacket, dismounted first. His partner, stockier but equally menacing, stayed astride his bike, smirking as his companion approached Joe. "Hey, old man," the taller one called, his voice laced with mockery. "Still playing soldier with that fake leg?" Joe's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. "Don't have time for your games," he muttered, his tone steady but edged with warning. The biker laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, you've got time, old timer. Plenty of it. Judging by that rust bucket you're fixing." He kicked Joe's toolbox, scattering the wrenches and screws across the gravel. Joe's hands clenched at his sides as he stared at the spilled tools. Slowly, he straightened, meeting the biker's mocking gaze. "Pick it up," Joe said evenly, his voice low but firm. "Pick it up?" The biker leaned closer, grinning. "What are you gonna do about it?" "Huh? Hop after me?" The stocky biker chuckled, revving his engine for emphasis. Joe didn't flinch, but the tension in his body was palpable. He fought against the surge of anger rising in his chest, a familiar heat he hadn't felt in decades. His mind flashed briefly to Normandy, where defiance and grit had kept him alive in impossible situations. But this wasn't Normandy. And these weren't soldiers. These were bullies. The tall biker shoved Joe's shoulder, sending him stumbling back a step. "Come on, Grandpa. Show me what you've got." Joe's prosthetic leg scraped against the gravel as he caught his balance. He glared at the man, the sharpness in his eyes momentarily cutting through the biker's smug expression. Before Joe could act, the sound of a screen door creaking open caught everyone's attention. A neighbor peeked out, her phone in hand. "I'm calling the cops," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. The bikers exchanged a glance, and the taller one stepped back. "This isn't over, old man," he sneered. "You'd better watch yourself." They mounted their bikes, engines roaring as they sped away. Joe stood motionless, his fists still clenched, watching their taillights fade into the distance. His chest heaved, not from exertion but from the frustration and humiliation simmering inside him. As the neighbor approached cautiously, Joe waved her off, bending to gather his scattered tools. His hands shook slightly as he placed each wrench back in the box. "This isn't over," Joe muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. But in his heart, the words were a promise. That evening, Fred Marshall sat in a folding chair outside the small community center nestled in the trailer park. The air was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the usual hum of crickets. A few others were already there, gathered around a picnic table lit by a dim overhead bulb. Among them was Bill Carson, a wiry man in his late 70s, who wore a faded Marine Corps ball cap over his silver hair. Bill adjusted his eye patch, his remaining eye narrowing in frustration. "Damn punks," he muttered. "Think they can just walk in here and do whatever they want? They're not just punks." Earl Thompson chimed in, his gravelly voice calm but firm. Earl, a stout man with grease-stained hands, had been a tank mechanic in Vietnam. Now, he was the unofficial handyman of the trailer park. "I've seen their kind before. This isn't random. They're testing us, seeing how much they can push before we break." Fred sat silently, listening. The group had dealt with trouble before, break-ins, petty theft, but nothing like this. These bikers were different, organized, bold, and clearly not afraid of consequences. "We can't fight them," a younger resident, Jake, said nervously. "They've got numbers. Guns. Probably. What do we have?" Fred finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "We've got each other. And I'm not about to let some thugs take over. Not here." Bill chuckled dryly. "Still got that fire in you. Huh. Fred?" Fred met his gaze. "We didn't survive wars just to roll over for a bunch of bullies." The others nodded hesitantly, a quiet resolve building in the group. Fred knew this fight wasn't going to be easy, but the spark of unity was there. Now, it just needed fuel. The low rumble of engines broke the morning calm like an approaching storm. Fred Marshall stepped out of his trailer, his gaze immediately locking onto the horizon. The Iron Fangs were back, this time with 5 bikes. The gang rolled in with calculated arrogance, their engines revving as they scattered gravel across the narrow roads of the trailer park. The leader, a stocky man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, dismounted first. Travis Andrews, the undisputed head of the Iron Fangs, took his time removing his helmet, revealing a smirk that made Fred's blood run cold. Behind him, the others followed suit, their laughter echoing through the quiet streets as they kicked over trash bins and broke flower pots. Fred stood rooted near his porch, his prosthetic leg steady as a rock. Bill Carson appeared from his trailer a few steps away, his eye patch giving him an almost piratical air as he surveyed the gang. Earl Thompson came out last, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, his brow furrowed with annoyance. Travis sauntered up to Fred, his smirk growing wider. "Morning, old man," he greeted mockingly. "We thought we'd drop by. See if you've changed your mind about paying up. Call it protection money." Fred crossed his arms over his chest. "We don't need your protection." Travis chuckled, motioning to his crew. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck, strode to a parked car and smashed a window with his fist. The sound of shattering glass made several residents peek out from behind curtains. "See?" Travis said, his tone conversational. "World's a dangerous place. Wouldn't want something like that to happen to your truck." Fred's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "This is our home. You're not welcome here." Travis stepped closer, invading Fred's personal space. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "But guts won't stop me from burning this whole dump to the ground." Bill stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You think you scare us? We've faced worse than you in our time." Travis's smirk faltered for a moment before he turned his attention to Bill. "Oh. The one-eyed wonder speaks. What are you gonna do? Gawk me to death?" Fred saw Bill's fists clench and quickly intervened. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've made your point. Now leave." The bikers laughed, but Travis raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "You're lucky I'm feeling generous today," he said, turning back to his bike. "But next time. I'm not asking nicely. You've got 1 week." As the gang roared away, Fred let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to Bill and Earl, his expression grim. "They're not bluffing," Earl said, tossing the rag over his shoulder. "If we don't stop them, they'll own this place." Fred nodded slowly. "Then we stop them." That evening, the trailer park felt like a ghost town. Residents huddled inside their homes, too scared to venture out. Fred, Bill, and Earl met at the small picnic area by the community center, their faces lit by a single flickering bulb. "We can't fight them head-on," Earl said, his voice low. "They've got numbers, weapons. We don't." Fred looked at his friends, his mind racing. Memories of Normandy flooded back, the nights of planning, the impossibly thin odds. "We don't need to fight them head-on," he said finally. "We just need to make them think twice about coming back." Bill frowned. "And how do we do that? Intimidation?" Fred shook his head. "No. We outsmart them. Use what we have. What they don't expect." The 3 men spent the next hour brainstorming, their conversation laced with quiet determination. Fred outlined a plan that drew heavily on his military experience, a strategy built on misdirection and quick strikes. The next day, as Fred walked through the park, he stopped to speak with residents. He reassured the frightened, motivated the unsure, and quietly rallied support. At one trailer, a young mother with 2 small children hesitated at her door. "I don't want trouble," she said softly, her voice trembling. Fred nodded, his tone gentle. "Neither do I. But if we don't stand up now, this won't stop. It'll get worse." She swallowed hard, glancing back at her kids before finally nodding. "What do you need?" At another trailer, an older man handed Fred an old bat. "I'm not as strong as I used to be," the man admitted. "But I can swing this if I have to." Fred accepted the bat with a firm nod. "That's all we need, everyone doing what they can." By nightfall, the trailer park wasn't just a community anymore. It was a team, united under Fred's quiet leadership. And they were ready. Fred, Bill, and Earl sat around the picnic table behind the community center. A crude map of the trailer park spread before them. Fred had sketched out the roads, key choke points, and potential places to set traps. A flickering lantern lit their faces, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of hard work and battle. "We can't match them in firepower," Fred began, his tone deliberate. "But we can use the terrain. Force them to split up. Confuse them. Make their numbers useless." Earl nodded, his hands busy as he dismantled an old car battery. "I can rig up some alarms. Tripwires attached to these old cans we've got lying around. They'll make enough noise to disorient them." Bill tapped the table with a wrench he'd brought. "They'll expect a fight," he said, his voice low but firm. "What they won't expect is us to fight smart." Fred leaned forward, pointing to a cluster of trailers on the map. "We set up the barricades here and here," he said, circling 2 points. "Force them into this narrow pathway. Earl, you and I will set traps there." "And me?" Bill asked. Fred met his gaze. "You'll watch the main road. If they try to flank us, you signal." The group fell silent as the weight of their plan settled over them. These weren't soldiers anymore, just 3 old men trying to defend their home. But none of them voiced doubt. They knew what was at stake. Earl broke the silence. "I've got some spare wires and nails in my shed. Might not be much, but it'll slow them down. Fred nodded. Every second counts. Let's get to work. The three dispersed, each carrying the resolve of men who had faced impossible odds before and won. The night was eerily quiet as Walter, Sam, and Henry crept through the overgrown brush toward the abandoned warehouse. The faint hum of diesel engines and muffled voices carried through the air, growing louder as they neared the building. Walter motioned for the others to stay low, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows for movement. From their hiding spot, they could see a semi-truck parked beside the warehouse. Men in leather vests moved methodically, unloading large crates and stacking them near the dock. One of the bikers barked orders, his voice rough and commanding. "Move it. We don't have all night." Henry squinted, his wiry frame tense. "What do you think's in those boxes?" Walter's gaze narrowed as he spotted a label on one of the crates, ammunition. His stomach churned. "They're not just thugs, they're armed to the teeth," he murmured. Sam shifted beside him, adjusting his grip on an old disposable camera he'd brought along. "We need evidence," he whispered. "Something solid to take to the cops." Walter nodded and gestured toward a narrow crack in the warehouse wall. The three men crawled closer, careful to avoid the gravel that could give them away. Through the gap, they had a clear view of what was happening inside. Travis, the gang's leader, stood at the center of the room, his scarred face illuminated by a flickering overhead light. Two men in suits stood opposite him, their polished shoes and expensive briefcases a stark contrast to the biker's rugged appearance. One of the men opened a briefcase, revealing stacks of crisp $100 bills. "Everything's here," Travis said, his voice low but firm. "Guns, ammo, and the powder. The shipment leaves at dawn." One of the men nodded, his tone clipped. "No mistakes, Andrews. Our buyers don't tolerate delays." Henry's hands clenched into fists as he listened. "They're not just running guns, they're trafficking drugs too," he muttered under his breath. Sam snapped a photo, the faint click of the camera almost inaudible. He took another, capturing the crates, the briefcase, and Travis mid-conversation. Walter placed a steady hand on Sam's shoulder. "Be quick," he urged, his voice barely audible. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the dock. A biker cursed as he dropped a crate, spilling ammunition across the ground. One of the men inside turned toward the noise, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "What was that?" the man asked, his tone suspicious. The biker shrugged. "Just clumsy hands. I'll get it cleaned up." Walter exhaled slowly, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. Sam snapped one final photo and slipped the camera back into his pocket. Just as they prepared to retreat, a voice from the dock froze them in place. "Hey! Did you hear that?" One of the bikers near the truck cocked his head, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol on his belt. His boots crunched on the gravel as he took a few steps toward their hiding spot. Henry's breath hitched, his wiry frame stiffening like a coiled spring. Walter raised a hand, silently signaling for everyone to stay still. His mind raced, calculating their options. The biker took another step, his eyes scanning the bushes. A shout from inside the warehouse broke the tension. "Get back here! We're behind schedule." The biker hesitated, then turned and jogged back toward the truck. Walter motioned for the group to move, their retreat slow and deliberate to avoid making noise. When they were far enough away to speak, Henry let out a shaky breath. That was too close. Sam pulled out the camera, his expression grim. "We've got what we need. Now we just have to get it to someone who'll listen." Walter's face was set in determination. "And we'll make sure they do." This ends here." The three men disappeared into the night. Their resolve hardened by what they had uncovered. The Iron Fangs weren't just a gang terrorizing their community, they were part of something much larger and far more dangerous. Walter stood in the center of the trailer park's community lot. His voice steady but urgent as he addressed the gathering. The residents. A mix of families. Retirees. And a handful of younger people. Stood in a nervous circle around him. The tension was palpable. But Walter's calm demeanor anchored them. "This is our home," Walter began. His prosthetic leg planted firmly. "The Iron Fangs think they can take it from us. That will roll over because they have numbers. But they've underestimated us. They don't know what we've been through. What we're capable of." Henry stepped forward. His wiry frame practically vibrating with energy. "Walter's right," he added. "These punks don't scare me. I've faced worse in the jungles of Vietnam." Sam nodded from the back, holding up a hammer. "We might not have their firepower. But we've got something better, brains and teamwork." Walter pointed to a crude map he'd drawn on the pavement with chalk. "We're going to use every advantage we have. They're coming in expecting an easy fight. But we'll make them regret stepping foot here." Walter, Henry, and Sam immediately began organizing the defense. Earl's expertise as a mechanic became invaluable as he repurposed old car parts into makeshift barricades. He worked tirelessly, rigging the entrances to the trailer park with piles of tires, scrap metal, and wooden planks. Henry joined him, stringing up noise traps around the perimeter. He used fishing line to attach cans filled with loose nails and bolts, ensuring that any movement would create a loud clatter. As he worked, he muttered to himself, memories of ambushes in Vietnam flooding back. "This takes me back," Henry said, glancing at Walter. "Different war, but the same fight." Walter paused, watching the older man's hands tremble slightly as he tied a knot. "We're not soldiers anymore, Henry," Walter said gently. "But we know how to protect what matters." Meanwhile, Sam rallied the younger residents to help reinforce the defenses. He taught them how to set up barricades and explained the importance of staying calm under pressure. At one point, a teenage boy named Jake hesitated, his hands shaking as he tried to nail a plank into place. "I've never done anything like this before," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Neither had I, back in the day. But you learn fast when it counts. You're doing good, kid." Jake nodded, his confidence bolstered. He hammered the nail in place with more determination. As dusk approached, Walter gathered the group for a final run-through of the plan. The map was now dotted with marks indicating trap locations and defensive positions. "Here's how it'll go," Walter explained. "When they come, we funnel them into this narrow path. The barricades will slow them down, and the traps will give us the upper hand. Stick together. Keep your heads down. And trust the plan." Earl raised a hand. "And if they break through?" Walter's jaw tightened. "Then we fight with whatever we've got. We don't let them win." That night, as the preparations neared completion, Walter took a moment to himself. He stood by the edge of the park, staring into the darkness where he knew the Iron Fangs would soon appear. His mind raced with memories, both of his time in Normandy and the hardships he'd faced since returning home. Sam joined him, his hammer still in hand. "You okay, Walter?" Walter nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just thinking." Sam smirked. "About the war?" Walter glanced at him. "About everything. Back then, we fought for our country. Now, We're fighting for something just as important, our families. Our lives. Sam leaned against the barricade. You've always been the one to step up when it matters. Walter. You're the reason we've got a chance. Walter didn't respond immediately. His gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he said, "We'll make it through this. Together." As the final nails were hammered and the last traps set, the trailer park fell into an uneasy silence. The residents huddled in their designated positions, their faces tense but resolute. Walter walked through the camp one last time, offering quiet words of encouragement. To a young mother clutching her toddler, stay low. And don't panic. You're stronger than you think. To an older man holding a makeshift club, swing hard. And don't give them an inch. Walter's final stop was with Henry and Earl, who stood near the main barricade. "This is it," Walter said, his voice steady. "They're coming." Earl grinned, his hands resting on a wrench. "Let 'em come. We'll show them what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Henry nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We've got this, Walter. No matter what." Walter looked at them both, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Let's make sure we do." The three men took their positions as the night grew darker, the distant sound of engines growing louder by the second. They were ready. The distant roar of motorcycle engines grew louder, like an ominous drumbeat echoing through the still night. Walter Marshall crouched behind the first barricade, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. He gripped a crowbar tightly, the cold metal pressing into his palms. Beside him, Sam adjusted his grip on a makeshift slingshot, and Earl silently tested the tension of a tripwire he had just secured. The Iron Fangs arrived in force. Travis Andrews led the pack, his scarred face illuminated by the dim glow of headlights. Behind him, a dozen bikers fanned out, their motorcycles rumbling like thunder. They stopped just short of the barricades, the gang dismounting with practiced ease. Travis stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "All right, old man," Travis shouted, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I gave you fair warning. This is your last chance. Hand over what we want, or we'll burn this place to the ground." Walter stepped out from behind the barricade, his prosthetic leg clinking softly against the pavement. He held the crowbar loosely in one hand, his face calm but unyielding. "You're not getting anything, Travis. You can turn around and leave, or you can regret staying." The bikers laughed, their jeers echoing across the trailer park. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, called out, "Look at him! Still playing soldier." Travis smirked. "You've got guts, Walter. But guts won't stop us." Walter didn't flinch. "Neither will you." The gang moved toward the barricades, but the residents were ready. The first biker to step over the wire triggered a loud clatter as cans filled with nails crashed together, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The man stumbled, cursing as he fell into a pile of debris. Earl grinned from his hiding spot. "That's one." The bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. Sam took advantage of the moment, launching a small rock from his slingshot. It struck one of the gang's headlights, shattering the glass. The bikers yelled in frustration, revving their engines as they regrouped. Travis barked orders. "Stop screwing around. Tear down those barricades." They charged again, this time more cautiously. Two of the bikers began dismantling the barricade, pulling at the wooden planks and metal scraps. As they worked, Walter gave a sharp whistle. From behind a nearby trailer, Bill appeared, holding a hose connected to a tank of pressurized water. He sprayed the bikers with a powerful stream, sending them sprawling. "Still think we're easy pickings?" Bill shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. The bikers regrouped. But the traps had bought the residents time. Walter moved to the second line of defense, where Henry was waiting with a pile of old tires soaked in grease. As the bikers advanced, Henry lit the edge of the pile with a lighter. Flames erupted, creating a wall of fire that blocked the main path. Travis snarled, his patience wearing thin. "Enough of this. Take them down." He led the charge this time, his brute strength smashing through the smaller barricades. Walter stepped forward to meet him, his crowbar raised. The two men clashed, Travis swinging a heavy wrench while Walter dodged and countered. "You're a stubborn old fool," Travis growled, swinging wildly. "Why don't you just give up?" Walter ducked another swing, his voice calm despite the exertion. "Because this is my home, and I don't let bullies win." Walter's crowbar caught Travis's wrist, sending the wrench flying. The gang leader stumbled back, clutching his arm. Around them, the residents were holding their own. Sam and Earl worked in tandem, using tools and whatever they could find to fend off the bikers. Bill, despite his age, wielded a wooden bat with surprising precision. The fight reached a crescendo as police sirens pierced the night. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wreckage of the barricades. The bikers froze, their confidence evaporating as squad cars screeched to a halt at the entrance of the trailer park. Officers poured out, guns drawn. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" Travis's jaw tightened, but he had no choice. He raised his hands slowly, glaring at Walter. "This isn't over." "Old man," he spat. Walter, breathing heavily but still standing tall, met his gaze. "Oh, it's over. You just don't know it yet." The bikers were rounded up one by one, their weapons confiscated. As the officers began loading them into patrol cars, the residents emerged from their hiding spots, bruised but victorious. Walter leaned against the remains of a barricade, his crowbar resting at his side. Earl approached him, a tired grin on his face. "We did it, Walter. We held them off." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah. But it's not just about tonight. It's about making sure they don't come back." Sam joined them, clapping Walter on the shoulder. "And we'll be ready if they try. You showed us that." Walter allowed himself a small smile. He looked around at the battered but determined faces of the residents. They had fought for their home and won, and for the first time in a long time. Walter felt the same pride he had on the battlefield. Walter stood silently near the edge of the trailer park, watching the red and blue lights of the police cars fade into the distance. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and grease, remnants of the fight that had unfolded just hours ago. Around him, residents began emerging cautiously from their homes, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. Sam walked up beside him, still holding the hammer he'd used earlier. "You did it, Walter," he said quietly. "We did it." Walter glanced at him, his face unreadable for a moment before a faint smile appeared. "We all did it," he corrected. "This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone standing together." Nearby, Henry helped a young mother secure her door, while Earl shared a laugh with Bill over a dented trash can that had served as a makeshift shield. Despite the chaos of the night, there was a strange sense of calm now, a quiet acknowledgement of what they'd achieved. As Walter looked around, pride swelled in his chest. "They'll think twice before coming back here," he muttered, mostly to himself. He tightened his grip on his crowbar and added, more firmly. And if they do, they'll know what they're up against.
A gang of bikers terrorizes a small community, demanding submission, but an aging veteran, burdened by his past, yet fueled by resilience, refuses to back down. What happens when courage faces ruthless power? Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey coming tomorrow.